Every month, on the exact day my pension was deposited into my account, my son showed up at my door. Daniel always had a new reason, a new story, and the same old smile. That morning was no different. I was standing in the kitchen when I heard a key turn in the lock. The door opened and a familiar voice called out, gentle, almost cheerful, "Mom, it's me." I walked into the living room. Daniel was standing there, still holding the key I had given him years ago, back when I believed that key would be used to visit his mother, not to take her money. He smiled. The same slightly crooked smile that tilted to the right, the one I had known since he was a boy, whenever he lied about who had broken the vase in the hallway. But this time, the smile lasted only a few seconds, because right there, in the middle of the living room, sitting in the armchair where my husband used to read the newspaper every morning, was a stranger. The man wore a dark suit, his back straight, a leather briefcase resting neatly on his knees. Daniel froze. I watched the color drain from my son's face so quickly that it was not very comforting. His hand began to shake, the key nearly slipping from his fingers. "Mom, what is this?" His voice was no longer steady. He sounded less like a man in his 40s and more like a child caught doing something wrong. I didn't answer right away. I looked straight at my son and said slowly, clearly, one word at a time, "Today you sit down and you listen to your mother." If you're listening to this story and see something of your own family in it, you're not alone. Here, we tell stories about love, boundaries, and respect for those who have given too much for too long. If you want to keep listening, stay with us. To understand why I was sitting there that morning, facing my son alongside a lawyer, you need to know what happened before that. My husband, Robert, passed away 3 years ago. We'd been married for more than 40 years. It wasn't always smooth, but it was long enough for our habits to blend together without thinking. He died suddenly, right in the backyard, while watering the apple trees he had planted himself when Daniel was still a child. After the funeral, the house felt too big, not because of its size, but because of the silence. In the evenings, there were no familiar footsteps. In the mornings, there was no rustle of newspaper pages, no soft coughing in the kitchen. Some nights I woke up and reached across the bed out of habit, then stopped when my hand touched nothing but cold, empty space. I was 69 years old. I had spent my entire life working in a school cafeteria. My pension wasn't much, but it was enough to live on if I was careful. I had this house, a garden, and a few kind neighbors. On paper, I lacked nothing, but inside, I felt empty. I ate irregularly. Some days, I forgot lunch entirely. On other days, I sat staring at a cold plate of food for a long time without touching it. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because eating alone made me tired. Daniel began visiting more often after his father died. Every time he came, the house felt warmer. There was a conversation, laughter, the feeling that I was still someone's mother, that someone still needed me. I clung to those visits more than I wanted to admit. There were things around the house I could easily handle myself. The dripping faucet in the kitchen, the door that creaked, the hallway light bulb had been dim for ages. I knew I could call a repairer, but I didn't. I waited. Then I called Daniel. "Are you free to come by and help your mom with something?" Each time he came, after fixing the small problem, we would sit and drink coffee. I listened to him talk about work, about the city, about things I was no longer part of. And in those moments, I felt like I hadn't been completely left behind. Daniel was my only child. After Robert died, he became the last support I clung to, even though I never said it out loud. And maybe that was why I didn't notice, or didn't want to notice, that at some point, the line between being cared for and being taken advantage of had begun to blur. After a while, Daniel's visits became more regular. They were no longer quick stop-ins followed by a rush to leave. He stayed longer, had dinner with me, and sometimes even washed the dishes. I didn't ask why. I enjoyed the feeling of having someone in the house. One weekend afternoon, Daniel called ahead. "Mom, I'm coming over today. I want to introduce someone to you." When he arrived, there was a young woman beside him whom I had never met. Daniel introduced her as Laura. Laura smiled politely and shook my hand lightly. Her manner was courteous enough, not overly familiar, but not openly cold either. Still, from the very first few minutes, I noticed something tiny that, looking back, I wish I had paid more attention to: Laura's eyes. While I was making tea, she looked around the living room, not the harmless curiosity of someone visiting for the first time, but a slow, careful gaze that lingered on each item. The old wooden cabinet, the dining table set, the framed photos on the wall, as if she were memorizing everything. I told myself I was overthinking. We sat and talked. Daniel spoke about work. Laura nodded from time to time and added a few comments. She didn't ask much about me, and she didn't ask about Robert. I didn't hold it against her. Not everyone knows how to talk to a woman who has recently lost her husband. When they left, I stood at the door watching them go. Daniel turned back and waved. Laura smiled again, quick and neat. The next day, Margaret, the neighbor who lived across the street, stopped by. "Evelyn, your son brought his girlfriend over yesterday, didn't he?" I nodded. "Yes. She seems fine." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then said very softly, "Just keep an eye out. I'm not saying she's bad, it's just some people know very clearly what they want." I smiled, trying to lighten the conversation. Kids these days are all like that. Margaret didn't say anything else, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't entirely at ease. In the weeks that followed, Daniel brought Laura over more often. Sometimes I felt happy because the house was filled with voices and laughter again. Other times, I felt like a guest in my own home. Laura became familiar with her way around the kitchen. She knew how I liked my coffee. She even knew where I kept my notebook and documents. I kept reminding myself that this was normal. My son had a girlfriend. Eventually, he would get married. I couldn't keep him to myself forever. But there was one thing I didn't tell anyone. Every time Laura sat down, I felt as though I was being watched. Not with words, but with silence. As if she were measuring how much I could give and how much I still had left. I felt that unease. I saw the signs very early on, but I chose to stay silent because at that time, what I feared most wasn't being taken advantage of. It was losing Daniel. A few months after Laura first appeared, Daniel called me one late afternoon. His voice was different from usual, not rushed, not cheerful. There was a hesitation I recognized immediately, the same tone he had used as a child whenever he was about to say something difficult. "Mom, can I come over? I want to talk." Daniel arrived looking tense. He sat down on the sofa. His hands clasped together and stayed silent for a long while. I didn't rush him. I was used to waiting for my son to speak. Finally, he took a deep breath. "Laura and I were planning to get married." I froze for a moment. Then the first feeling that rose up wasn't worry but relief. At least Daniel wouldn't be alone. At least he had someone by his side. I smiled. "Is that so? When?" Daniel talked about the venue, the tentative date, and the things that needed to be prepared. Then his voice slowed. "Mom, I know this isn't easy to say, but the wedding is more expensive than we thought. Laura and I are trying to manage, but we're still short." I didn't answer right away. I looked at Daniel, at that familiar face, and in my mind, I saw Robert. I remembered our wedding day. It wasn't big or elaborate. Robert once told me that what mattered wasn't the ceremony, but having someone standing beside you when things got hard. Daniel went on, his voice softer. "If you could help us a little, just this once, I promise I'll pay you back." The amount Daniel mentioned was not small. It was most of the savings Robert and I had put away over many years. The money made me feel safe because I knew that if something happened, I would still have something to rely on. I looked down at my hands. I was old. I didn't need much. I didn't travel. I didn't shop. I lived. And Daniel was starting a new life. I thought about what Robert would say if he were still alive. He might frown, he might hesitate, but in the end he would soften, just like I did then. "All right," I said. "I'll help." Daniel looked up immediately. His face lit up. He stood and hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." In that moment, I felt like I still mattered, like I was still needed. That warmth was so comforting that I didn't want to think about anything else. The next day, I transferred the money. Daniel texted to thank me. He said he wouldn't forget. He said that after the wedding, things would be better. I believed him. I believed him because I was his mother, and because at that time I had no idea that I had just opened a door, one that would not be easy to close later. After the wedding, Daniel still came by my house, but those visits were no longer the same. He didn't stay long. He didn't drink coffee. He didn't chat anymore. Every time he came, Daniel had something he needed to talk about. And I gradually grew used to seeing the hesitation on his face the moment he walked in. The first time after the wedding, it was about his car. "Mom, my car broke down on the road. The mechanic says some parts need to be replaced urgently, or I won't be able to get to work." I asked how much. Daniel named the amount. I did the math in my head and nodded. I transferred the money that same afternoon. Daniel thanked me and promised to pay it back soon. A few weeks later, there was another call. This time, it was credit card debt. "It's piled up too much, Mom. If I don't deal with it soon, the interest will keep growing." Then there was a course Daniel said he needed to get promoted. Then there was a time when Laura needed urgent dental work. Then more minor, more scattered amounts, but they came regularly. I no longer remember every story clearly. I only knew that every time pension day drew near, my heart felt a little heavier. I started keeping records, an old notebook with a worn cover tucked into a drawer. Every time I transferred money, I wrote down the date, the amount, and the reason Daniel gave. At first, I did it to remember. Later, I did it to reassure myself that everything was still under control. But the numbers in that notebook grew faster than I expected. Some evenings, I sat alone, opened the notebook, stared at my own handwriting, then closed it again. I told myself this was just a difficult phase, that once things stabilized, Daniel would stop. Sometimes a thought briefly crossed my mind. Why is it always me? But I pushed it away quickly. I was afraid that if I thought too deeply, I would have to face something I wasn't ready to face. I began cutting back on my expenses. I stopped buying unnecessary things. I delayed fixing the leaking roof. I switched to a cheaper medication. I told myself I was old and didn't need much. Meanwhile, Daniel and Laura kept posting photos online. Restaurants, weekend trips, meals I no longer allowed myself to think about. I didn't ask. I didn't complain. I told myself that a mother shouldn't keep score, that money mattered less than knowing her child was okay. But deep inside, a feeling I couldn't quite name began to grow. It wasn't exactly anger. It wasn't exactly pain. It was the sense that I was slowly becoming a place Daniel came to when he needed something, then left as soon as he was done. I still opened the door every time he came. I still transferred money every time he asked. And I kept convincing myself that this was only temporary. About a year after the wedding, Daniel came to my house one rainy afternoon. He didn't sit down right away. He paced back and forth in the living room, his hands clenched tight. I looked at my son and knew that whatever he was about to say this time would not be small. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "Laura is pregnant." My heart started pounding. I froze as if I hadn't fully understood the words. Then a wave of warmth rushed over me, sudden and overwhelming. I was going to be a grandmother. Daniel went on, faster now. But the doctor says it's a high-risk pregnancy. There needs to be many tests and close monitoring. The cost isn't cheap. I asked if it was serious. Daniel nodded. He said they were worried. He told Laura was scared. He said this was when they needed me the most. I looked at my son. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Not just because of Daniel, but because of that unborn child. A little life whose face, cry, and tiny fingers curling around mine I had already begun to imagine. The amount Daniel mentioned was larger than before. I didn't have it on hand. I borrowed part of it from Margaret. I borrowed more from my sister. I postponed fixing the leaking roof. I gathered it bit by bit. Daniel came to collect the money looking relieved. He hugged me, thanked me, and said I was the most excellent support his little family had. When the door closed behind him, I sat down in my chair for a long time. I was tired, but my heart felt a little more at ease. I thought I was doing the right thing. That evening, I took out some old yarn from the closet. I didn't know whether the baby was a boy or a girl. I chose 2 colors, light blue and pale pink. I knitted slowly, 1 stitch at a time. Some nights I stayed up late, knitting and thinking about Robert. I imagined him holding his grandchild, smiling gently the way he used to when Daniel was small. I knitted in silence. I knitted in hope. 3 weeks later, I picked up my phone while waiting for the water to boil. A photo appeared on social media. Laura was sitting in a bar. In her hand was a glass of red wine. She was smiling, relaxed, without hesitation. She didn't look like someone pregnant, let alone someone with a high-risk pregnancy. I stared at the screen. I zoomed in on the photo, then zoomed out. I checked the posting date. Everything was clear. I called Daniel. Once, then again. No one answered. I sent a message. "Honey, I need to talk." The message was read, but there was no reply. I set the phone down, my hands shaking. The half-finished knitted blanket slipped from my lap. The blue and pink yarn lay tangled together, half complete, half meaningless. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there staring into the empty space in front of me. In my mind, I saw every transfer, every promise, every hug, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think about something I had always avoided before. That maybe there was no baby at all. That maybe I had been lied to. And this time, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the last bit of trust I still had left in my own family. I didn't call Daniel again that day. Not because I didn't want an explanation, but because I was afraid that if I heard one, I would find a way to believe it again. I knew I needed time to steady myself before facing the truth. 3 days later, I had to go out to buy groceries. The refrigerator was empty. I took my old cloth bag, planning to stop by the familiar neighborhood store. Still, for some reason, I ended up driving to the large supermarket downtown. Maybe I just wanted to be somewhere else, even if only for a moment. I pushed the cart slowly down the aisles. The prices made me hesitate. I was bent over, looking at a price label, when I heard a familiar laugh behind me. I turned around. Laura was standing at the wine section next to a blonde woman. Their cart was full of expensive items, wine, imported cheese, and chocolates I had never bought. I was about to step forward. Then I stopped. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to hear. I stood behind a nearby shelf. Not too close, but close enough to catch a few words when they spoke louder than necessary. "She believes everything," Laura said lightly, as if telling a funny story. The other woman laughed. "Seriously?" "Yeah, Daniel has to sound serious. The pregnancy, the risks." She didn't ask a single follow-up question. I didn't hear the rest of the conversation. I didn't need to. That one sentence was enough. I left the supermarket without buying anything. I don't remember how I drove home. I only remember sitting down on the sofa, my hands ice cold, even though the house was warm. That evening, I opened social media again. I went through every photo Daniel and Laura had posted over the past few months. I compared dates. On the day Daniel said he needed money for medical tests, they posted photos at an upscale restaurant. On the day I borrowed money to help them get stable, they went away for the weekend. Everything lined up with cruel precision. I took out the old notebook. I flipped through each page. The numbers I had avoided were now unmistakably clear. I added them up. Then I added them again to be sure. The total was larger than I had imagined. I set the notebook down and sat still for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt tired. A deep kind of tired, as if my body had finally accepted what my mind had been trying to hide for so long. I thought about Robert. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, the afternoons I picked him up from school. I thought about the unfinished knitted blanket, and I understood something. The truth doesn't need to be heard in whole to hurt. It only needs to land in the right place. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table, the notebook in front of me, my phone beside it. I didn't know what I would do next, but for the first time in a long while, I stopped reassuring myself. I didn't tell myself that everything would be fine. I didn't look for excuses for Daniel. I admitted one straightforward thing. I trusted him, and I was betrayed. And from that moment on, I knew that if I didn't protect myself, no one else would do it for me. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because I couldn't sleep anymore. As soon as the sun rose, I made myself a cup of black coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my notebook again. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the anger I thought I would. The feeling was more like discovering that a room has been leaking for a long time. The damp smell had become so familiar that you didn't notice it until you finally saw the crack clearly on the wall. I began to put everything in order. I printed bank statements, sorted messages, wrote down dates, reasons, and amounts. I worked slowly and carefully, not for revenge, just because I needed to know where I stood and how far I had let this go. Around noon, I called Michael, the son of an old friend. He's a lawyer. I had met him a few times at family gatherings and never thought I would one day call him about something like this. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a quiet breath. "Evelyn," he said, "I need to be honest. Your situation isn't simple. There are no clear loan agreements. If this goes to court, you might not get the money back and you could lose your son." I stayed silent. I lost my son. I had thought about that. I had thought about it all night. Michael continued, more slowly. "But if you want to stop this, if you want them to stop asking for money, there is a way. It will be very hard, and you'll have to confront Daniel directly." I looked out the window. The apple trees were still there. The house was still standing. Nothing had changed, except me. "I don't want to destroy my son," I said. "I just want him to stop, and I want to live the rest of my life without being afraid of pension day." Michael nodded. "Then we'll prepare. But you need to be ready. Daniel won't accept this easily." After the call, I sat alone for a long time. At one point, I picked up my phone. I thought about texting Daniel to tell him everything was fine, that I was okay, that I still believed him. One message, and everything could go back to the way it was. But then I thought about the knitted blanket, about the money I had borrowed, about how many times I had stayed silent to hold on to a relationship that was slowly draining me. I put the phone down. For the first time in many years, I didn't choose the easiest path. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I didn't go looking for Daniel. I chose a different way. I chose to stand on my own side, not because I stopped loving my son, but because I understood that if I kept staying silent, love would turn into nothing but fear, and I didn't want to live my remaining years that way anymore. Daniel arrived on the same day he always did. No call ahead, no message. The key turned in the lock as usual, so familiar that I used to feel reassured by the sound. But that morning, I didn't get up right away. I was sitting in the living room. Michael sat in the armchair by the window, his leather briefcase resting neatly on his lap. We didn't speak. Everything was ready. Daniel walked in, looking hurried. He started talking immediately, as if afraid that if he stopped, he would have to hear the answer. "Mom, I'm in a bit of trouble. We need—" He stopped when he saw Michael. "Who is he?" Daniel asked, his voice faltering. I looked at my son, really looked at him. New clothes, an expensive watch, a grown man standing in front of his mother, using the same opening line he had repeated for years. "Sit down," I said. My voice was calmer than I expected. Today, I'm the one who's going to talk. Daniel hesitated for a few seconds, then sat down on the edge of the sofa. He didn't look at me. Michael opened his briefcase and laid out the documents on the table. Bank statements, printed messages, my notes, everything arranged neatly, nothing extra. I picked up the old notebook. "Since your wedding," I began, "do you know how much money I've given you in total?" Daniel said nothing. I read out each amount. Not fast, not slow. I didn't add emotion and I didn't hide anything. I read exactly what had happened. When I reached the money for the so-called high-risk pregnancy, I stopped. I placed the unfinished knitted blanket on the table, right in the middle of the papers. "Do you remember this?" I asked. "I made it for the grandchild you said was on the way." Daniel looked up. His face went pale. Michael spoke, his voice clear but not harsh. "Daniel, your mother has sufficient evidence to show that you repeatedly asked for money using false information. We could take this to court." Daniel turned to me, his eyes reddening. "Mom, I can explain." "Not right now," I said. "For the past 3 years, you've talked. I've listened. Today is different." Michael continued, "You have 2 options. One is to go to court, where everything will be laid out. The other is to repay part of the money under an agreement, along with a commitment to never ask for more." Daniel shook his head. "I don't have that kind of money." "That is no longer your mother's problem," Michael replied. "You'll have to figure it out yourself." Daniel looked at me. "Mom, please, I'm your son." I took a slow breath. "You're right. And because you're my son, I can't keep pretending this didn't happen." Daniel jumped to his feet, his voice rising. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is." "All I'm doing," I said, "is setting a boundary. One I should have set a long time ago." The room fell silent. Finally, Daniel sat back down. His shoulders slumped. Michael slid the agreement toward him. "You have time to read it," Michael said, "but the decision is yours." Daniel took the paper, his hands trembling slightly. I looked at my son and understood that no matter what choice he made, this moment had already changed everything. No shouting, no tears, just the truth laid out in the very room where I once believed family was the safest place of all. Daniel left that day without saying another word. The door closed and the house returned to its familiar quiet. But this quiet wasn't the same as before. It wasn't heavy and it wasn't comforting. It was simply empty. I sat on the sofa for a long time. Michael gathered the papers, gave a few final instructions, and then left. When I was alone, I looked around the living room. Everything was still in its old place. Only the way I felt had changed. 3 days later, the first payment was deposited into my account. There was no message, no explanation. Just a number appearing on my phone screen. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel relieved the way I thought I would. I just felt tired. In the months that followed, the money continued to come in regularly, on time, the exact amounts. Still, there were no messages attached. I got used to checking my account early in the morning, then turning off my phone and not thinking about it anymore. I used part of the money to fix the roof. The leak had been there for a long time. I called a contractor, signed the papers, and paid without the hesitation I used to feel. When the first rain fell after the repairs, I stood in the kitchen, listening to it, and realized I wasn't anxious anymore. I bought the medication I used to take, not the cheaper version. I went to the grocery store and put beef in my cart, the kind of thing I had always skipped before. Small things, but at that time, they felt unfamiliar. Guilt. Every time I spent money, I felt as if I were doing something wrong, as if I were taking something that didn't belong to me. I had to keep reminding myself that it was my money, that I had worked my whole life for it. The house was still empty in the evenings. Daniel didn't come by. There was no sound of keys, no short conversations in the kitchen. Some nights I sat alone, looking at the chair where Michael had once sat, and wondered whether I had done the right thing. Sometimes I missed my son so much it hurt in my chest. Sometimes I picked up my phone, opened the message screen, then closed it again. I knew that if I called, if I asked, everything could slide back to the way it was very quickly. I didn't want that. Margaret came by more often. We drank tea and talked about small things. She didn't ask much. She was just there. Her presence was enough to keep me from feeling completely alone. I began to arrange my life around my own rhythm, slower, with less waiting, with fewer hopes tied to unexpected knocks at the door. The money came. The house stayed empty. And in that emptiness, I began to realize something. Peace doesn't arrive all at once, but it comes when you no longer have to fear the day your pension is deposited. About 2 months after that confrontation, I heard that Daniel and Laura had broken up. Not from Daniel, from Margaret. She told me very softly, as if afraid I would be hurt. I just nodded. In truth, I had already guessed it. Relationships built on convenience and money rarely hold when those things are taken away. Daniel didn't call. He didn't text. But the money was still transferred on time, regularly, coldly, without a single word attached. Many times I wondered whether that was regret or simply an obligation. One morning, Michael called me. "Evelyn, I want you to know something. Daniel has started seeing a therapist, not because you asked. It was something he agreed to on his own during discussions with the other lawyer." I held the phone in silence for a moment. "I'm not telling you this to soften your heart," Michael continued. "I just think you should know. Change, if it comes, won't be fast." I thanked him and hung up. That evening, I sat alone for a long time. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel happy. I just felt a quiet sadness. Sadness from realizing that my son had gone very far before stopping. Sadness because the price of that lesson was too high for both of us. The following months passed slowly. Daniel still didn't reach out, but I noticed slight changes. No more flashy photos online, no more constant trips. His social media gradually grew emptier. I didn't actively follow him. I only noticed when I happened to scroll past. Once, when the money was transferred, there was a very short line attached. "I've sent this month's payment." That was all. I read that line several times. There was no "Mom," no emotion, but it was the first time Daniel had said anything on his own after months of silence. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what to say without slipping back into my old role. I was afraid that if I said one more word, everything would slide back to where I had worked so hard to escape. I began to accept that change, if it came at all, wouldn't look like the stories people like to tell. There would be no grand apology, no tearful reunion, no dramatic return, only small actions, slow ones, hard to see, and easy to lose if I don't hold my boundaries. I learned to see Daniel as an adult who had to carry the consequences of his own choices, rather than a child who needed to be protected. That didn't make the pain disappear, but it helped me stand more firmly, and I understood something I had never allowed myself to think before, that loving your child doesn't mean rescuing them from every consequence. Sometimes, loving your child means letting them face themselves. Daniel's call came on a quiet afternoon. I was watering the garden when my phone vibrated. I saw my son's name on the screen and stood still for a few seconds, the hose still in my hand. My heart beat faster, but the panic I once felt was gone. "Mom," Daniel said when I answered. His voice was low and tired. "Can I see you? Just for a little while." I stayed silent. I didn't want to answer out of old habit. I needed to think about whether the meeting would be good for me, not just for him. "Where?" I asked. "At the park near your house. If it's not convenient, it's okay." "Tomorrow afternoon," I said. 3:00. I arrived a little early and sat on a bench under the trees. I watched people walk by, small families, elderly couples. Life was moving on normally, even though so much inside me had changed. Daniel arrived on time. He looked different, not much thinner, but less tense. Simple clothes, no expensive watch, no familiar urgency. We greeted each other with a nod, no hug, no touch. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said. I nodded. "What did you want to say?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I know you might not believe me, but I want to say I'm trying to change." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react too quickly. He talked about therapy, about having to look at himself honestly, about the shame of realizing what he had done. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't mention Laura. He didn't try to make himself pitiful. When he finished, I spoke. "I'm not promising anything," I said slowly, "but there are a few things I need to be clear about." Daniel looked at me attentively. "First," I said, "from now on there will be no money between us. No loans, no help, no exceptions." He nodded immediately. "I understand." "Second," I continued, "I need honesty. If you're not okay, you can say so. But if you lie, I will stop immediately." Daniel swallowed. "I understand." "Third," I said, "if at any point I feel that these meetings are hurting me, I will stop. No explanations. You have to respect that." Daniel looked down, then nodded again. "I agree." We sat quietly for a moment. The air wasn't as tense as I had expected, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was the silence of two people learning how to talk to each other again from the beginning. "We can start with short meetings," I said. "Once in a while, there's no need to try to go back to how things were." Daniel looked at me, his eyes turning red. I wouldn't dare hope for more than that. When he stood to leave, he hesitated, then said softly, "Thank you for not closing the door completely." I watched as Daniel walked away. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel afraid. I only knew that for the first time, our relationship was no longer built on me having to give to be kept. And that, even fragile as it was still a beginning. After that, my life slowed down in a very different way. I no longer counted the days until Daniel came. I no longer tensed up as pension day approached. I began making plans for tiny things, but for myself. I fixed up the living room, repainted the faded wall, planted a few more flower pots on the porch, things I had always put off, telling myself, maybe later, or I should save that money in case my son needs it. Now, I didn't need to wait anymore. Margaret stopped by often. We drank afternoon tea and talked about little things. I rejoined the neighborhood group I had once abandoned because I didn't have the emotional space. I realized I wasn't nearly as alone as I had believed. Daniel continued to repay the money, on time, without complaints, without asking for anything. We met occasionally, just as we had agreed. Sometimes it was just a short walk, sometimes a quiet coffee. No forced closeness, no digging up the past. I don't know where our mother-son relationship will go. I can't say that I've forgotten everything that happened, but I know one thing very clearly. I no longer trade my peace for a relationship at any cost. I still love my son. That love hasn't disappeared, but it has changed shape. It is no longer a blind sacrifice, no longer silent endurance. It is love with boundaries. Some evenings, I sit alone in the living room, looking at the photo of Robert and me on the wall. If he were still alive, he would be saddened by what happened, but he would also understand why I had to do what I did, because respecting myself doesn't make me a bad mother. It simply makes me a more whole human being. I've learned that family isn't just about blood. Family is about respect. It's a place where older people aren't treated as burdens or as a safe source of money. It's a place where love doesn't come with fear. And I've also learned that it's never too late to choose again, to choose to live for yourself, to choose to keep your dignity, to choose to say enough when it's necessary. My name is Evelyn, a mother, a woman who gave too much, and finally, someone who learned how to keep what was left for herself. If your parents are still with you, listen to them a little more. Not because they need money or help, but because they need to be respected while they can still feel it. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you see a part of yourself or someone you love in it, stay with us. Here, every story reminds us how to love without losing ourselves,